Every secret tells a story.
The first snow of December had settled over St. Mary Mead like a benediction, transforming the familiar village into something from a Christmas card. Cottage windows glowed warmly against the gathering dusk, and the scent of wood smoke and roasting chestnuts drifted through the crisp air. From the bell tower of St. Mary's came the gentle practice chimes of Christmas carols, as Mr. Lionel Reed prepared for the midnight service with his customary perfectionism. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen shawl as she made her way along the snow-dusted lane toward Meadowbank House, where Mrs. Isabel Hartwell had arranged her annual Christmas Eve gathering. It was a tradition that had endured for nearly 2 decades, ever since Mrs. Hartwell had inherited the Georgian manor from her late aunt and established herself as one of the village's more prominent hostesses. The invitation, written in Mrs. Hartwell's careful script, had arrived precisely 1 week prior, neither too early to seem presumptuous, nor too late to appear an afterthought. Miss Marple had always found Christmas Eve gatherings to be particularly revealing of human nature. The season of goodwill had a curious way of highlighting its opposite in those who felt themselves overlooked or disappointed by life's arrangements. Tonight, she suspected, would prove no exception, given the undercurrents of tension that had been rippling through the village in recent weeks. The source of this unease was Mrs. Hartwell's house guest, a Mr. Barnaby Ashford, who had arrived unexpectedly 10 days earlier, claiming distant kinship through a forgotten branch of the family tree. He was a man of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and an expensive overcoat that spoke of London tailors. His charm was undeniable, yet there was something in his manner, a calculating quality beneath the polished exterior, that had set the village talking. Mrs. Price Ridley had been heard to remark that some people simply appeared when there was money to be inherited, while Dr. Haydock had observed with clinical detachment that Mr. Ashford seemed remarkably well informed about the Hartwell family's financial affairs for such a distant relation. Meadowbank House glowed with festive warmth as Miss Marple approached the front door. Through the tall windows, she could see the familiar figures of the village's social circle moving about the drawing room, their voices creating a cheerful counterpoint to the soft piano music drifting from within. Young Timothy Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell's nephew and heir, was at the piano, his fingers moving skillfully over the keys as he played a gentle arrangement of Silent Night. The maid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Daphne, took Miss Marple's coat with a curtsy that spoke of careful training. "Mrs. Hartwell is in the drawing room, miss? Shall I announce you?" "That won't be necessary, dear," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I'll find my way." The drawing room was decorated with tasteful restraint. Holly and ivy wound around the mantelpiece, a modest Christmas tree adorned with candles and silver ornaments, and the warm glow of a coal fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Mrs. Hartwell, a handsome woman of 60 with prematurely silver hair, moved gracefully among her guests, ensuring everyone had refreshment and engaging in the sort of pleasant conversation that kept social gatherings flowing smoothly. Miss Marple accepted a glass of mulled wine and found herself a comfortable chair near the fireplace, from which she could observe the assembled company with her customary discretion. There was Colonel Melchett, retired and somewhat pompous, holding forth on the declining standards of modern military service to anyone within earshot. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was discussing the Christmas pageant arrangements with Miss Hartnell, their voices carrying the particular intensity that church matters seem to inspire in devoted parishioners. Near the piano, a small group had gathered around Timothy Hartwell, including his fiancée, Miss Clara Beaumont, a spirited young woman whose modern ideas occasionally clashed with the village's more traditional sensibilities. Dr. Haydock stood nearby, his medical eye taking in the scene with professional interest, while Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, maintained his usual position near the refreshment table, where he could observe the proceedings while remaining diplomatically neutral. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in Mrs. Hartwell's manner. though her hostess duties were performed with perfect grace. There was a tightness around her eyes and a slight tremor in her hands when she thought herself unobserved. This anxiety seemed to intensify whenever her gaze fell upon Mr. Barnaby Ashford, who had positioned himself near the window, regaling Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley with tales of his recent travels. Mr. Ashford was indeed a compelling speaker, with a sort of practiced charm that suggested considerable experience in social manipulation. His stories were entertaining, his compliments well-timed, and his knowledge of current affairs impressive. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying not his words, but his eyes, which held a coldness that his warm smile could not quite mask. There was something predatory in the way he watched Mrs. Hartwell, as though he were a cat observing a particularly plump mouse. The evening proceeded with the comfortable rhythm of established tradition. Carols were sung with varying degrees of musical ability, and Mrs. Hartwell's cook had outdone herself with an array of seasonal delicacies. It was during a particularly enthusiastic rendition of "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen" that Miss Marple noticed Mr. Ashford slip quietly from the room. She observed his departure with the mild interest she reserved for all human behavior, noting that he moved with the careful stealth of someone who preferred not to be followed. Perhaps 20 minutes later, as the company was settling into more intimate conversations around the fire, young Daphne appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she clutched her apron. "Please, ma'am," she said to Mrs. Hartwell, her voice barely above a whisper, "could you come to the study? There's something wrong with the gentleman." The cheerful conversation died away as though someone had blown out a candle. Mrs. Hartwell rose with admirable composure, though Miss Marple noticed the way her knuckles whitened as she gripped the back of her chair. "What sort of something wrong, Daphne?" she asked quietly. "He's on the floor, ma'am, Mr. Ashford, and he isn't moving." Dr. Haydock was already moving toward the door, his medical training overriding social convention. "I'll have a look," he said briskly. "Everyone else should remain here for the moment." But human curiosity is a powerful force, and within minutes the entire company had gravitated toward the study, a small book-lined room at the rear of the house where Mrs. Hartwell conducted her correspondence and managed the household accounts. The door stood ajar, revealing a scene that would remain etched in their memories long after the Christmas decorations had been packed away. Mr. Barnaby Ashford lay sprawled beside the mahogany desk, his expensive evening clothes disheveled and a dark stain spreading across his white shirt front. His eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, and his face wore an expression of profound surprise. Beside his outstretched hand lay a heavy brass paperweight in the shape of a Christmas angel, its wings now darkened with something that was decidedly not festive cheer. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his examination swift but thorough. When he rose, his face was grim. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "The man is dead. We must telephone the police immediately." The word "police" fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and dismay that spread through the assembled guests. Mrs. Hartwell swayed slightly, and Timothy moved quickly to support her arm. Miss Hartnell pressed a handkerchief to her lips, while Colonel Melchett began muttering about the decline of civilized society. Miss Marple, who had remained in the doorway throughout this discovery, allowed her gaze to move methodically around the study. She noted the way the desk drawers had been pulled open and their contents scattered, the overturned brandy decanter that had left a dark stain on the Persian carpet, and most particularly a small sprig of holly that lay crushed beneath the window, holly that matched the decorations in the drawing room but had no business being in this particular location. As the others stood frozen in shock and dismay, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead's Christmas celebration had taken a decidedly sinister turn. The uninvited guest who had arrived so unexpectedly had now departed, in a manner that was equally unexpected, though far more permanent. The season of peace and goodwill had delivered instead a most unwelcome gift, a murder that would test not only the village's Christmas spirit, but also their carefully maintained social facades. The snow continued to fall gently outside the study window, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within, as the quiet village found itself once again in the grip of violent death. Miss Marple tucked her knitting more securely under her arm and prepared to observe, with her customary patience and keen intelligence, the unfolding of what promised to be a most complex and revealing investigation. The silence that followed Dr. Haydock's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of snow tapping against the windows. Mrs. Hartwell stood very still, her hands clasped before her with the sort of rigid composure that comes from years of managing social crises, though none quite like this. "Timothy," she said quietly, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Would you please telephone Inspector Slack? The number is beside the telephone in the hall." Young Timothy nodded mutely and hurried from the room, grateful for something practical to do. His fiancée Clara moved instinctively to Mrs. Hartwell's side, offering a steadying arm, though her own face had gone quite pale beneath her carefully arranged hair. Dr. Haydock positioned himself firmly in the doorway of the study. "I'm afraid no one should enter this room until the police arrive," he announced with medical authority. "The scene must remain exactly as we found it." Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, cleared his throat delicately. "Quite right, Doctor. Perhaps we should all return to the drawing room while we wait. The police will want to examine everything undisturbed." The small group began to disperse reluctantly, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of shock and speculation. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer than the others, her keen eyes taking in details that might prove significant later. She noticed that the study's French doors to the garden were slightly ajar despite the December cold, allowing a thin drift of snow to accumulate on the threshold. More intriguingly, she observed that while Mr. Ashford's evening clothes were disheveled, his gold pocket watch remained securely fastened to his waistcoat, curious if robbery had been the motive. "Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock's voice was gentle but firm, "I really must insist that everyone leave now." "Of course, Doctor," she replied with her characteristic mild manner. "Such a dreadful thing to happen on Christmas Eve. Poor Mrs. Hartwell must be quite distressed." As they rejoined the others in the drawing-room, Miss Marple observed how completely the festive atmosphere had transformed. The Christmas tree's candles still flickered cheerfully, their warm light now illuminating faces, marked by anxiety and suspicion rather than holiday joy. The seasonal decorations that had seemed so welcoming an hour earlier now felt almost mocking in their persistent cheer. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had taken charge of practical matters with the efficiency born of years of parish work. She directed young Daphne to prepare strong tea while ensuring everyone had comfortable seating. Colonel Melchett had assumed the role of unofficial authority figure, positioning himself near the fireplace and speaking in the clipped tones he had once used to address subordinates. "Shocking business," he declared to the room at large. "Fellow comes as a guest and ends up murdered in his hostess's study. What's the world coming to? Mark my words, it's bound to be some ruffian from outside the village. These London types make enemies, you know." "The question is," observed Miss Hartnell with characteristic directness, "who would want to kill him? He'd only been in the village 10 days, hardly enough time to make serious enemies here." "Unless," suggested Mrs. Price Ridley with the air of someone delivering significant intelligence, "he brought his enemies with him. A man doesn't simply appear out of nowhere claiming family connections without some reason. There's usually money involved in such cases." Miss Marple settled herself in her previous chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. To casual observers, she appeared entirely focused on her work, but her ears were carefully attuned to every conversation in the room. She'd learned long ago that people often revealed more than they intended when they believed themselves unobserved. Timothy returned from making his telephone call, his young face grave with new responsibility. "Inspector Slack is on his way from Much Benham," he announced. "He said we should all remain here until he arrives and that no one should disturb anything in the study." "How long will that be?" asked Dr. Haydock. 20 minutes, perhaps 30 with the snow," Timothy replied. "There's been some trouble with preparations for the Boxing Day fair, so he was already out on calls." The mention of Inspector Slack drew knowing looks from several villagers. The inspector was known throughout the district for his efficiency rather than his subtlety, and his investigations tended toward the direct approach of identifying the most obvious suspect and pursuing that theory with considerable determination. As they waited, conversation naturally turned to the deceased, and it was remarkable how quickly opinions could shift in the face of violent death. Mr. Ashford, who had been the subject of suspicious whispers only hours earlier, was now being discussed with the careful neutrality that the recently deceased seemed to inspire. "He certainly seemed knowledgeable about family history," offered Clara thoughtfully. "When I mentioned the portrait of Mrs. Hartwell's great-aunt in the hall, he knew immediately that she had been painted by Millet. Yes, he was remarkably well informed," agreed Mrs. Hartwell, though something in her tone suggested this knowledge had been more troubling than reassuring. "He knew details about family matters that I wouldn't have expected a distant cousin to possess." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "How distant a cousin was he exactly?" she inquired with mild interest. Mrs. Hartwell's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. "He claimed descent from my great-grandfather's brother, who emigrated to Canada in the 1870s. The family had rather lost touch, you understand." "And he had documentation to support this claim?" asked Mr. Petherick, his legal training asserting itself. "He showed me some papers," Mrs. Hartwell replied carefully. "Letters, a family tree, that sort of thing. They seemed authentic enough, though I confess I'm no expert in such matters." Dr. Haydock frowned thoughtfully. "Rather coincidental that he should appear just now, when you've been considering changes to your will." The words fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed slightly, and several guests exchanged meaningful glances. It was common knowledge in the village that Mrs. Hartwell had been contemplating alterations to her testament, particularly regarding the disposition of Meadowbank House and her considerable estate. "I don't see how that's relevant," said Timothy quickly, his protective instincts clearly aroused. "Aunt Isabel's private affairs are hardly matter for general discussion." "But they might be quite relevant to understanding why someone wanted Mr. Ashford dead," observed Miss Hartnell with characteristic bluntness. "If he had expectations regarding the inheritance." "He had no expectations," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly, though her voice carried a slight tremor. "I made no promises to him regarding my will." The sound of motor car tires crunching on gravel announced Inspector Slack's arrival. Through the drawing-room windows, they could see headlights cutting through the falling snow. Within moments, the inspector himself appeared in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow and his expression grimly professional. Inspector Slack was a man in his 40s with thinning hair and a mustache that he clearly believed lent him authority. His approach to investigation was methodical, if not particularly imaginative, and he had the unfortunate tendency to seize upon the first plausible theory and pursue it with single-minded determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, removing his coat and handing it to the hovering Daphne, "I understand there's been a death here this evening. I'll need to examine the scene first, then speak with each of you individually. I trust no one has left the premises since the body was discovered." "No, Inspector," replied Mrs. Hartwell. "We've all remained here as requested." "Good. Dr. Haydock, I assume you've examined the deceased?" "Briefly, yes. Head injury, blunt force trauma. From that brass paperweight, I'd say, given its position and condition. He's been dead perhaps 20 to 30 minutes. The body's still warm." Inspector Slack nodded grimly and disappeared into the study with Dr. Haydock. Through the partially open door, they could hear his brisk movements and occasional muttered observations. When he returned 20 minutes later, his expression was thoughtful. "Right then," he announced, positioning himself on the hearthrug. Preliminary examination shows the desk drawers have been rifled, and there are signs of a struggle. The French doors were found ajar, but there are no clear footprints in the snow outside. It's been falling too heavily. He consulted his notebook. Mrs. Hartwell, I understand Mr. Ashford was staying as your guest. Was there anything of particular value in that desk that someone might want? Mrs. Hartwell exchanged a quick glance with Mr. Petherick before answering. There was a packet of family papers tied with blue ribbon, old letters and documents relating to my aunt's estate. It appears to be missing. Missing, Inspector Slack repeated, making a note. And these papers, they would be valuable to someone claiming family connection. Possibly, Mrs. Hartwell admitted reluctantly. They contained details about inheritance patterns and family relationships going back several generations. While the inspector continued his questioning, Miss Marple had been quietly observing the reactions of those around her. She noticed how Timothy's jaw tightened whenever the conversation turned to inheritance matters, and how Clara watched Mr. Petherick with unusual intensity. Most intriguingly, she had spotted something the others had missed, a small piece of red sealing wax that had fallen between the cushions of her chair, bearing the distinct marks of having been bitten or chewed. The inspector was now taking preliminary statements, establishing where everyone had been when Mr. Ashford left the drawing room during the carol singing. The accounts they assembled showed the usual confusion of a busy social gathering. People had moved about, visited the refreshment table, stepped out briefly for various reasons. Miss Hartnell had gone to the cloakroom, Colonel Melchett had wandered to lecture Mr. Petherick about imperial matters, and young Daphne had taken a tray to the kitchen. So, Inspector Slack summarized, Mr. Ashford left during God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, and his body was discovered approximately 20 minutes later. During that time, several of you were moving about the house. He looked around the room with professional suspicion. I'll want detailed statements from each of you tomorrow, but for tonight I'm afraid no one can leave. The roads are blocked with snow in any case. Mrs. Hartwell nodded with admirable composure. Of course, Inspector. Daphne will show you to rooms. We'll manage somehow. As the evening wound toward its grim conclusion, Miss Marple reflected that the peaceful Christmas Eve gathering had delivered a most unwelcome gift. The uninvited guest who had arrived so mysteriously had now departed even more mysteriously, leaving behind a tangle of secrets that would require considerable unraveling. The season of peace and goodwill had been replaced by suspicion and fear, and Miss Marple settled her knitting more securely, knowing that morning would bring the real work of detection. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in pristine white that belied the darkness that had settled over Meadowbank House. The morning dawned with the peculiar hush that follows snowfall, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Meadowbank House stirred reluctantly to life, its usual Christmas morning bustle replaced by an atmosphere of subdued tension. Miss Marple woke early in her small guest room, her mind already turning over the events of the previous evening like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The pristine snow outside her window created a deceptively peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the turmoil within the house walls. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, where conversations were conducted in hushed tones appropriate to a house touched by violence. Mrs. Hartwell presided over the tea service with admirable composure, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes avoided direct contact with her guests. Timothy sat beside his aunt, his young face bearing new lines of worry, while Clara picked nervously at her toast, her usual vivacity replaced by anxious watchfulness. The festive decorations that had seemed so welcoming the night before now felt almost mocking in their persistent cheer. Inspector Slack had risen early and established himself in the morning room, methodically calling each guest for formal questioning. His approach was systematic if uninspired, following predictable patterns about alibis and motives. When Miss Marple's turn came, she found him seated behind a writing desk, his notebook open and his manner briskly professional. He regarded her with a mixture of patience and slight condescension that many officials reserved for elderly ladies. "Now then, Miss Marple," he began, consulting his notes, "you observed Mr. Ashford leave the drawing-room during the carol singing. Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior?" Miss Marple considered this carefully, her fingers working steadily at her knitting. "He seemed rather restless, Inspector. Not quite comfortable, if you understand me. Rather like my nephew Raymond when he's planning something he knows I won't approve of. He moved with the air of a person who prefers not to be noticed moving, which always calls attention, I'm afraid." After her interview, Miss Marple encountered young Daphne in the corridor, the maid's eyes red-rimmed from tears and obvious distress. With her characteristic gentle manner that invited confidences, Miss Marple remarked that it must be difficult to concentrate on duties after such a shocking event. "Oh yes, miss," Daphne said, brightening slightly with relief at having someone sympathetic to speak with. "It's all so dreadful, and to think I spoke with Mr. Ashford just yesterday morning about his correspondence." "His correspondence?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Yes, miss. He asked for the writing materials from the small table by the window. He was very particular about the sealing wax. Said ours took a better impression than his own. I watched him warm it and bite the end to soften it, then seal his letters with a little ring that had a lion on it. He wrote 2 letters and sealed one most carefully, asking if the study door was ever locked in the afternoons and whether the gardener used the back path by the French doors." Miss Marple tucked this information away with apparent casualness, though her mind was already working through its implications. A man preparing correspondence while inquiring about household routines suggested someone planning his next moves very carefully indeed. Later that morning, Dr. Haydock approached her with the air of someone seeking a confidential conversation. "I say, Miss Marple," he began quietly. "There's something the inspector asked me to keep confidential, but I feel you should know. The missing papers weren't the only thing taken from the desk. Mrs. Hartwell's personal correspondence was also disturbed, and there's a letter missing from her private files." "What sort of letter?" Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles pausing momentarily. "From a firm of private investigators in London. Mrs. Hartwell had been making inquiries about Mr. Ashford's background and family claims. The letter contained their preliminary report, and now it's gone." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the situation. Mrs. Hartwell's apparent acceptance of Mr. Ashford's story had been far more cautious than it appeared, and the missing investigator's report suggested that his identity and motives were more complex than anyone realized. Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the drawing-room, where she made several quiet observations that others had overlooked. Near the mantelpiece, a small blue fibre clung to the holly decoration where wire had been twisted, the exact shade of the ribbon typically used for tying document bundles. On the brass candle snuffer, a drop of red sealing wax had cooled, suggesting someone had conducted correspondence in this room rather than the study. Most intriguingly, she discovered in the wastepaper basket a small fragment of paper bearing part of an address. "Milson and Associates, Much Ben." The rest had been torn away, but it suggested Mr. Ashford had been planning to visit the local solicitors. Combined with Daphne's testimony about his morning activities, it painted a picture of a man preparing for some significant action. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical questioning, focusing increasingly on Timothy as the obvious beneficiary of Mr. Ashford's death, Miss Marple reflected that the solution lay not in obvious motives of inheritance, but in the deeper currents of deception surrounding the mysterious visitor. The Christmas guest who had arrived uninvited had brought secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect, and those secrets were hidden in the small details that others dismissed as insignificant. The morning progressed with the household remaining in suspended animation, but Miss Marple sensed that beneath the surface, calm, the real drama was only beginning to unfold. The morning light filtered through frost-etched windows, casting delicate patterns across the Persian carpets of Meadowbank House. Christmas Day had arrived with the peculiar hush that follows both fresh snowfall and violent death, transforming the festive manor into something resembling a genteel prison. The household moved with careful deliberation, as though sudden movements might shatter the brittle composure that held them together in the aftermath of Mr. Ashford's murder. Miss Marple rose early and found herself drawn once again to the study threshold, where Inspector Slack had positioned his constable to preserve the scene. Her keen eyes noted details that others had overlooked in their shock the previous evening. The French doors, now firmly bolted, showed evidence of having been opened at 2 different times. Overlapping crescents of melted snow marked the carpet, one dried to a faint tide mark, the other still damp and glistening. Most intriguingly, the crushed holly sprig bore the telltale marks of florist's wire, the same type used only on the drawing-room mantelpiece, according to young Daphne's whispered confirmation. "We used wire only for the mantel garland, miss," the maid had explained nervously. "Miss Hartnell insisted it looked neatest there." Yet here was a sprig in the study, far from its intended location, suggesting someone had moved decorative elements for purposes unknown. Inspector Slack's investigation had settled into a methodical rhythm, with the unfortunate tendency toward the obvious that Miss Marple had observed in many official inquiries. His second interview with Timothy Hartwell had clearly intensified his suspicions, and when the young man emerged from the morning room, his face bore the pallor of someone under serious accusation. "The inspector seems convinced I had the strongest motive," Timothy confided to Clara, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "He keeps asking about my financial situation and whether I knew about Mr. Ashford's inheritance claims, as if money were the only reason anyone might commit murder." Mrs. Hartwell, overhearing this exchange, moved protectively to her nephew's side. The strain of the investigation was beginning to show in her careful composure, and Miss Marple observed the tremor in her hands as she poured tea with mechanical precision. "What exactly is Inspector Slack suggesting?" she asked quietly, though her tone carried an edge of defensive anger. Dr. Haydock's arrival with his medical bag provided a momentary distraction from the household's growing tension. His examination of the body had revealed details that complicated Inspector Slack's emerging theory. The angle of the fatal blow suggests the killer was considerably shorter than Mr. Ashford, he announced quietly to Mrs. Hartwell. "Timothy is nearly 6 feet tall, while the deceased was perhaps 5'8". The physics simply don't support the inspector's assumptions." This revelation should have been reassuring, but Miss Marple noticed it seemed to increase rather than decrease the general anxiety. Several guests exchanged meaningful glances, and the medical evidence was clearly pointing toward a different category of suspect entirely, one that included most of the women present and several of the older gentlemen. Meanwhile, Mr. Petherick had been conducting careful conversations with various guests, his legal mind gathering information with professional discretion. When he approached Miss Marple's chair, his manner was deceptively casual. "I've been thinking about those missing papers," he said quietly. "Mr. Ashford had approached me earlier in the week, asking about collateral inheritance rights. I declined to advise him without proper consultation, but his questions were remarkably specific for someone claiming distant kinship." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "Indeed, one might wonder whether he sought to prove his claims or to prevent others from disproving them." Their conversation was interrupted by Timothy's return from his second interview, his indignation now mixed with genuine fear. "He thinks I killed Ashford to protect my inheritance," Timothy announced to the assembled company. "But there's more to it than that. Ashford wasn't just claiming family connection, he was blackmailing Aunt Isabel." This revelation sent fresh murmurs through the room. Mrs. Hartwell's face went white, but she nodded confirmation. He had documents that appeared legitimate, suggesting his claim to a significant portion of my estate. He offered to reconsider his position in exchange for certain considerations. Mr. Petherick advised against any accommodation. The solicitor's expression was grim. Mr. Ashford was essentially attempting extortion through obscure family law, combined with threats to expose certain family matters, though he never specified what scandal he claimed to possess. Miss Marple absorbed this information while her fingers worked steadily at her knitting. The blackmail motive broadened the field of suspects considerably, but it also explained several puzzling elements. She recalled Daphne's account of Mr. Ashford's careful correspondence preparations, his specific questions about household routines, and his inquiry about the gardener's path by the French doors. Most significantly, Chita remembered the small piece of red sealing wax she had discovered between the chair cushions, wax that bore the faint impression of having been bitten to soften it, exactly as Daphne had described Mr. Ashford's method. Yet this fragment had been found in the drawing room, not the study, suggesting correspondence had been conducted in multiple locations. The missing investigator's report continued to trouble her thoughts. Mrs. Hartwell had been conducting her own inquiry into Mr. Ashford's background, which suggested she had suspected his claims from the beginning. The report's disappearance indicated someone had powerful reasons to prevent its contents from becoming known. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical but increasingly narrow investigation, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern of evidence emerging. The physical clues, the displaced holly with its telltale wire, the blue fiber caught on the mantelpiece that matched no thread in Clara's sewing basket, the overlapping watermarks suggesting multiple visits to the study, all pointed toward careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The Christmas guest who had arrived so mysteriously was revealing his secrets even in death, but Miss Marple suspected the most significant revelations were yet to come. Someone in this house had killed with calculation and cunning, and that same intelligence was now working to ensure the obvious suspect would bear the blame. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the frost-etched windows of Meadowbank House, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gloom that had settled over the Christmas gathering. Inspector Slack's investigation had taken on an increasingly determined focus, with Timothy Hartwell bearing the brunt of official suspicion despite Dr. Haydick's medical evidence suggesting the killer's shorter stature. The inspector's confidence in his theory appeared to grow with each interview, built more on the convenience of obvious motive than careful observation of contradictory facts. Miss Marple positioned herself near the drawing-room fireplace, her knitting needles working with practiced rhythm while her keen eyes observed the subtle dynamics playing out around her. She had noticed that Mrs. Hartwell's composure, though admirable, carried an underlying tension that seemed to intensify whenever the conversation turned to the missing investigator's report. The woman's hands trembled slightly when she thought herself unobserved, and her gaze frequently drifted toward the study door with an expression that suggested more knowledge than she had yet revealed. During a brief lull in the inspector's questioning, Miss Marple made her way to examine the drawing-room mantelpiece more closely, ostensibly to admire the Christmas decorations. Her careful inspection revealed several details that others had overlooked in their shock and distress. The holly garland showed signs of recent adjustment, with small tears in the greenery, where wire had been hastily repositioned. Most intriguingly, she discovered a tiny nick in the gilt molding behind the swag, no more than the impression of a thin cord drawn taut and then yanked free with considerable force. Young Daphne appeared with fresh tea, her face still pale with anxiety. Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about the household's Christmas preparations elicited an unexpected revelation. Miss Hartnell came back late last evening after we found him, Daphne whispered. She said the garland was sagging something dreadful, and insisted on fixing it proper, stood right on the fender stool and tugged at the wire, muttering about vulgar displays. Seemed strange, considering what had just happened. This information cast Miss Hartnell's late-night decorating activities in a decidedly different light. The precise, controlling woman who managed village committees with military efficiency had chosen to rearrange Christmas decorations immediately after a murder had been discovered. Miss Marple filed this detail away with her growing collection of seemingly insignificant observations. Dr. Haydock's return from his more thorough examination of the body brought additional complications to Inspector Slack's straightforward theory. The victim shows signs of an earlier altercation. He reported quietly to Mrs. Hartwell. Fresh scratches on his hands and a bruised knuckle, sustained perhaps 20 minutes before death. It suggests Mr. Ashford was involved in some sort of physical struggle before the fatal encounter. This medical evidence implied that the evening's events had been more complex than a single confrontation. Someone had engaged with Mr. Ashford physically before his death, leaving him injured but alive. The fatal blow had come later, delivered by different hands or in different circumstances entirely. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Clara Beaumont, who sat beside Timothy with obvious distress. The young woman's usual vivacity had been replaced by anxious watchfulness, and Miss Marple noticed how her eyes frequently sought out Mr. Petherick's face, as though seeking reassurance or guidance. When Clara excused herself to fetch a handkerchief, Miss Marple observed her pause beside the Christmas tree, her hand briefly touching one of the inner branches where the candlelight didn't penetrate. The solicitor, Mr. Petherick, had been conducting discreet telephone conversations throughout the day, his legal training evident in his careful inquiries. When he approached Mrs. Hartwell with obvious reluctance, his news added another layer of complexity to the mystery. "I've received additional information about our Mr. Ashford," he said quietly. "It appears his background is considerably more complicated than his family claims suggested. The London investigators had uncovered evidence of previous schemes involving inheritance fraud." Mrs. Hartwell's face went white at this revelation. "You mean he wasn't a legitimate relative at all?" "It's unclear," Petherick replied carefully. "But his methods of approaching wealthy families with complex inheritance situations follow a distinct pattern. The missing report would have detailed these findings comprehensively." Miss Marple absorbed this information while continuing her methodical observation of the household's behavior. Inspector Slack's investigation was proceeding along predictable lines, focusing on obvious motives and convenient suspects. Yet the physical evidence told a different story entirely, one of careful planning and desperate concealment rather than spontaneous violence. The afternoon's revelations had transformed Mr. Ashford from a mysterious relative into something far more sinister, a professional confidence man whose presence threatened more than inheritance claims. His death was beginning to look less like murder for financial gain and more like the desperate act of someone whose secrets were about to be exposed. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected that the Christmas guest who had arrived so unexpectedly was revealing his true nature even in death. The peaceful village gathering had concealed currents of deception and desperation that ran far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Someone in this house possessed secrets worth killing to protect, and that same intelligence was now working carefully to ensure the obvious suspect would bear the blame. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the village in deceptive tranquility, while inside Meadowbank House, the real drama was only beginning to unfold. Evening descended upon Meadowbank House with the peculiar weight that follows revelation, as though the very air had thickened with unspoken truths. The household moved through the rituals of dinner with mechanical precision, their conversations carefully neutral while undercurrents of suspicion flowed beneath every polite exchange. Inspector Slack had declared his intention to conduct a thorough search of the premises, his confidence in Timothy's guilt apparently unshaken by the mounting evidence that pointed toward a more complex solution. Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the drawing room, where the Christmas decorations maintained their cheerful vigil despite the grim circumstances. Under the pretense of admiring Mrs. Hartwell's tasteful arrangements, she conducted a more thorough examination of the mantelpiece, her fingers delicately testing the holly garland where she had previously noted the suspicious nick in the gilt molding. Her patient investigation revealed something far more significant than decorative wire. a small fragment of paper, singed at the edges and nearly invisible against the dark wood behind the swag. The fragment bore the unmistakable letterhead of Milson and Associates, Much Benham, and contained portions of what was clearly the missing investigator's report. The visible text, though incomplete, was revelatory. Subject: Barnaby Ashford, alias believed. Pattern consistent with previous approaches to widows of means. Cooperation with female confederate identified by initials CB. Not a blood relation per Canadian records. The remainder had been burned away, but the implications were staggering. Mr. Ashford had not been working alone, and his confederate was someone whose initials matched those of a person currently in the house. Miss Marple's contemplation of this discovery was interrupted by the arrival of the village gardener, summoned at last from his cottage by Inspector Slack's methodical thoroughness. The man stood respectfully in the doorway, his weathered hands turning his cap nervously as he addressed Mrs. Hartwell with obvious reluctance. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said quietly, "but there's something I ought to mention about last evening. I was checking the greenhouse this morning on account of the cold, and I noticed bicycle tracks in the snow by the back path. Fresh they were, leading from the lane to near the garden wall and back again. Not mine, ma'am. I walked to chapel on Christmas morning, and the tracks were made after the snow started falling proper." Inspector Slack seized upon this information with evident satisfaction. "Bicycle tracks, you say? Leading to and from the house? That suggests our murderer had assistants, someone waiting outside to carry away whatever was stolen from the study." The inspector's theory, while logical on its surface, failed to account for the more subtle implications of the gardener's testimony. Miss Marple noted that the tracks led to the garden wall rather than the house itself, suggesting someone who knew the property well enough to avoid the main approaches while still accessing the grounds quickly and quietly. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple observed the household's reactions to these developments with her characteristic patience. Clara Beaumont's behavior had become increasingly agitated, her usual social confidence replaced by nervous watchfulness. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she served tea, and Miss Marple noticed how her eyes frequently sought out Timothy's face as though seeking reassurance or guidance. Most tellingly, Clara had taken to wearing gloves throughout the day, claiming sensitivity to the cold, though the house was adequately heated. Dr. Haydock's medical observations continued to complicate Inspector Slack's straightforward theory. His examination had revealed that Mr. Ashford bore defensive wounds on his hands and a bruised knuckle, injuries sustained perhaps 20 minutes before his death. This evidence suggested two separate confrontations, an initial struggle that left the victim injured but alive, followed by the fatal encounter in the study. The implications were disturbing, pointing toward either multiple attackers or a killer who had engaged with their victim twice during the evening. Mr. Petherick's legal inquiries had yielded additional troubling information about their deceased guest. The solicitor's discreet telephone conversations throughout the day had confirmed that Mr. Ashford was indeed a professional confidence man whose schemes typically involved wealthy families with complex inheritance situations. His method was to appear with convincing documentation and compelling family stories, extract what he could through a combination of legitimate claims and subtle blackmail, then disappear before his victims could mount effective resistance. The missing investigator's report represented more than simple evidence of Mr. Ashford's fraudulent background. It would have detailed his current schemes and potentially identified his confederates. Its theft from Mrs. Hartwell's desk suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both the investigation and the household's routines. Someone who understood exactly what information posed the greatest threat to their safety. As the uncomfortable evening drew toward its close, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern of evidence that was emerging with increasing clarity. The physical clues, the singed report fragment hidden behind the mantelpiece, the bicycle tracks suggesting careful planning, the displaced holly with its telltale wire marks, all pointed toward someone with detailed knowledge of the house and its surroundings. The psychological evidence was equally revealing, showing a killer who possessed both the intelligence to plan carefully and the desperation to take enormous risks. Inspector Slack's methodical but increasingly narrow focus on Timothy threatened to obscure the real solution, which lay hidden in the small details that others dismissed as insignificant. The initials CB from the investigator's report hung in Miss Marple's mind like a key waiting for its lock, while Clara's nervous behavior suggested secrets that ran far deeper than simple concern for her fiancé's reputation. The Christmas guest who had arrived with such mysterious credentials was revealing his true nature even in death, but the most dangerous revelations were clearly yet to come. Someone in this house had killed with careful calculation, and that same intelligence was now working systematically to ensure an innocent man would bear the consequences of their deadly deception. Miss Marple settled her knitting more securely in her lap, knowing that the morning would bring the crucial test that would separate guilt from innocence and reveal the truth hidden beneath the season's cheerful facade. The night settled over Meadowbank House with an oppressive weight that seemed to press against the frost-covered windows, as though the very darkness held its breath in anticipation of further revelations. Inspector Slack had declared his intention to conduct a thorough search of all guest quarters in the morning, a pronouncement that sent visible tremors of anxiety through the assembled company. The inspector's confidence in Timothy's guilt had crystallized into an almost zealous determination, despite the mounting inconsistencies that Miss Marple continued to observe with her characteristic patience. Sleep proved elusive for most of the household. Miss Marple found herself drawn to her window overlooking the garden, where the pristine snow created deceptive patterns of innocence beneath the pale moonlight. Her mind worked methodically through the evening's discoveries, particularly the singed fragment of the investigator's report with its damning reference to a Confederate identified by the initials CB. Yet something in her long experience of human nature suggested that the most obvious interpretation might prove to be precisely what someone wanted her to believe. The early hours brought an unexpected development when young Daphne, pale and trembling, appeared at Miss Marple's door with urgent whispers about strange activities in the night. The maid had been awakened by the sound of the kitchen door opening and closing, followed by muffled movements in the garden. When she had dared to peer through her window, she had glimpsed a figure wheeling a bicycle toward the lane, moving with the careful stealth of someone who preferred to remain unobserved. "It was a lady, miss," Daphne whispered, her voice barely audible in the corridor's shadows. "I couldn't see her face proper, but she wore a dark cloak and moved like she knew exactly where she was going. The bicycle made that same wobbling sound the gardener mentioned, like a wheel that wasn't quite true." This testimony added another layer to the complex web of deception surrounding Mr. Ashford's death. Miss Marple reflected that someone was taking considerable risks to manipulate the evidence, suggesting either desperation or carefully orchestrated plan to ensure an innocent person would bear the blame for their crime. Dawn brought Inspector Slack's promised search, conducted with methodical thoroughness that left no corner unexamined. The inspector's satisfaction was evident when his constable discovered, hidden beneath Timothy's wardrobe, the missing packet of family papers tied with blue ribbon. The young man's protests of innocence carried the ring of truth, but Inspector Slack's mind was already made up, and he examined the evidence with the air of a man whose theories were being vindicated by facts. Miss Marple observed the ribbon's knots with particular interest, noting the distinctive left-handed pattern that spoke of habits formed in childhood and maintained through life. When she casually inquired whether Clara might help her untangle a similar ribbon from her knitting bag, the young woman's automatic tying motion revealed the same reversed loops, a detail that should have been damning but somehow felt too convenient, too perfectly arranged for discovery. The morning's most significant development came when the village constable returned from following the bicycle tracks, carrying a leather satchel retrieved from a ditch near the old mill stream. The bag's contents proved to be extraordinarily revealing. The complete investigator's report from Milson and Associates detailing Barnaby Ashford's history as a professional confidence man and his pattern of collaboration with female accomplices who posed as distant relatives or family friends. The report painted a chilling picture of systematic fraud, with Ashford's confederate typically introduced as a charming young woman whose apparent innocence helped to disarm victims while gathering sensitive information about their financial affairs and family vulnerabilities. Most damning of all, the description of this accomplice bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Clara Beaumont, down to specific physical details and preferences that seemed to point directly toward Timothy's fiancée. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very perfection of this evidence. The satchel's contents, while superficially convincing, lacked the subtle personal touches that would truly confirm ownership. The embroidered handkerchief bore an initial C in a florid script quite different from Clara's neat handwriting, and the silver locket, though elegant, was a common design rather than the unique antique pieces Clara typically favored. Most tellingly, the silk scarf was a shade of emerald green that Clara rarely wore, preferring the softer pastels that complemented her fair complexion. Dr. Haydock's medical examination had revealed additional complications to the emerging picture. Traces of chloral hydrate in Mr. Ashford's system indicated he had been sedated before his death, administered in brandy approximately 30 minutes before the fatal blow. This evidence pointed toward careful premeditation, requiring both access to medical supplies and detailed knowledge of the victim's drinking habits. When Miss Marple learned of Clara's brief nursing training, mentioned casually by Mrs. Hartwell during their morning tea, another piece of the puzzle seemed to fall into place. Yet the elderly detective's instincts warned against accepting even this apparently damning connection at face value. The evidence was accumulating too neatly, pointing too obviously toward conclusions that would satisfy Inspector Slack's desire for a swift resolution. The discovery of Mr. Reed's involvement in the bicycle repair added yet another dimension to the deception. The bell ringer's honest admission that he had been asked to replace a damaged wheel rim by a veiled young lady created a clear trail of evidence manipulation. Yet Miss Marple noted that the request had been made at dawn, after the murder had already been discovered and investigated. As the day progressed toward its inevitable climax, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of misdirection that surrounded Mr. Ashford's death. Someone had killed with careful calculation and was now working systematically to ensure that Clara Beaumont would bear the consequences of their crime. The Christmas guest who had arrived with such mysterious credentials was revealing his true nature even in death, but the most dangerous revelations were clearly yet to come. The evidence pointed toward Clara with increasing clarity, yet Miss Marple's experience told her that when a solution appeared too obvious, it was often because someone wanted it to appear that way. The real killer remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of planted evidence and manipulated clues, counting on Inspector Slack's methodical but unimaginative approach to deliver the wrong verdict. The morning's discoveries had raised the stakes considerably, and Miss Marple knew that the afternoon would bring the crucial test that would separate guilt from innocence and reveal the truth hidden beneath the season's deceptive cheer. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the drawing room of Meadowbank House as Inspector Slack arranged his evidence with the methodical satisfaction of a man whose theories were being vindicated by facts. Clara Beaumont sat with pale composure beside Timothy, her hands folded in her lap, with the careful stillness of someone who understood that her world was collapsing around her. The inspector's confidence was evident as he prepared to make his arrest, the planted satchel and missing family papers providing what he considered overwhelming proof of her guilt as Ashford's confederate. Miss Marple positioned herself near the fireplace, her knitting needles working with their customary rhythm while her keen mind processed the intricate web of deception that had been woven around the Christmas gathering. Something in her long experience of human nature rebelled against this apparently perfect solution. The evidence was too neat, too conveniently discovered, and it failed to account for several troubling inconsistencies that others had overlooked in their eagerness to solve the mystery. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, her mild voice cutting through the heated exchanges, "if I might make a small observation. I've been puzzling over the timing of various events, and I wonder if you might help clarify something that's been troubling me." Inspector Slack, accustomed to elderly ladies' irrelevant observations, nodded with barely concealed impatience. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "Well, you see, I've been thinking about those bicycle tracks that the gardener discovered. He mentioned they were made after the snow began falling properly, which would place them sometime after 10 o'clock. Yet the investigator's report was stolen from Mrs. Hartwell's desk during Mr. Ashford's visit to the study, which occurred around 8:30. How could Clara have known to prepare a bicycle for evidence disposal before she knew what evidence would need to be disposed of? This question hung in the air like a challenge, and Miss Marple noticed how several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Dr. Haydock frowned thoughtfully, while Mr. Petherick's legal mind clearly began working through the implications of the timing discrepancy. Most tellingly, Miss Hartnell's hands, which had been arranging sheet music with mechanical precision, suddenly went very still. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued with characteristic gentle persistence, "I've been examining the knots on that blue ribbon that bound the family papers. They're tied in a distinctly left-handed pattern, yet Clara is quite obviously right-handed. I've watched her pour tea and arrange flowers throughout our stay. When someone attempts to use their non-dominant hand for familiar tasks, the results are awkward and uneven. These knots, however, are perfectly executed, showing the unconscious expertise that comes only from lifelong habit." Inspector Slack's confidence wavered slightly, but he rallied with professional determination. "Criminals often attempt to disguise their methods, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled with gentle disagreement. "Oh, but Inspector, that's exactly what makes it so revealing. You see, I've also been examining the Christmas decorations quite carefully, and I discovered something rather interesting about that crushed holly sprig found in the study. The holly used throughout the house came from two different sources. The drawing-room arrangements used holly from the church grounds, identifiable by its distinctive leaf pattern and the particular type of florist's wire. Yet Clara had no involvement in the church decorations and would have no reason to carry church holly into the study." She paused to let this information settle, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. Someone else, however, had been adjusting those very decorations late on Christmas Eve, ostensibly to correct what she considered inadequate standards. "Miss Hartnell, wasn't it you who mentioned that the garland was positively unsafe and required immediate attention, even after such a shocking discovery?" Miss Hartnell's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "One must maintain standards," she said, her voice slightly too firm. A sagging garland would have been a dreadful reflection on Mrs. Hartwell's hospitality. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And then there's the matter of the chloral hydrate found in Mr. Ashford's system." Dr. Haydock noted that the dosage was remarkably precise. Too much would have rendered him immediately unconscious, too little would have been ineffective. It suggests someone with considerable experience in sedative administration, far beyond basic nursing instruction. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. Yes, the precision was quite remarkable. It would require advanced pharmaceutical knowledge. Miss Marple's keen eyes had been observing the reactions around the room throughout this gentle dismantling of the case against Clara. She noticed how Miss Hartnell's breathing had become carefully controlled, how her knuckles had whitened as she gripped the edge of the piano, and most particularly, how her gaze kept darting toward the study door before quickly returning to safer territory. But perhaps most revealing of all, Miss Marple continued, is the question of opportunity and knowledge. The killer needed intimate familiarity with the household routines, access to medical supplies, detailed knowledge of the property's layout, including the gardener's path to the French doors, and the sort of village connections that would allow them to obtain a bicycle repair at dawn without arousing suspicion. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of snow sliding from the roof. Inspector Slack's face showed the dawning realization that his methodical but unimaginative investigation had been skillfully misdirected, while the true murderer had counted on exactly this sort of obvious conclusion to conceal their guilt. Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable logic had systematically dismantled the case against Clara, while pointing toward a very different solution entirely. The real killer sat among them, their carefully constructed web of evidence beginning to unravel under the scrutiny of someone who understood that the most obvious solution was often the wrong one. The Christmas guest who had arrived with such mysterious credentials had indeed been eliminated by someone who understood both his true nature and the threat he represented, but that someone was far more clever and dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. As the winter light faded toward evening, Miss Marple prepared for the final test that would expose the truth hidden beneath the season's deceptive cheer. The twilight shadows deepened across Meadowbank House, as Miss Marple quietly suggested that perhaps they might all benefit from a moment's reflection in the warmth of the drawing-room. The company gathered with the subdued compliance of people who sensed that the evening's revelations were far from complete. Inspector Slack arranged his notes with less confidence than before, Miss Marple's gentle observations having introduced uncomfortable doubts into what had seemed a straightforward case against Clara Beaumont. Miss Marple settled herself near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her side, and regarded the assembled company with the mild attention of someone preparing to untangle a particularly complex pattern. The Christmas decorations maintained their cheerful vigil, though their festive spirit seemed increasingly at odds with the grim proceedings unfolding beneath their boughs. "Inspector," Miss Marple said with characteristic gentleness, "before we proceed further, I wonder if you might indulge an elderly lady's curiosity about small domestic matters. You see, I've been quite puzzled by those blue ribbons that bound the family papers, and I find myself wondering about the habits that reveal us whether we will or no." She reached into her knitting bag and produced 2 lengths of blue ribbon, identical to those used for document bundles. "Clara, my dear, would you be so kind as to tie one of these for me? My poor fingers find such tasks increasingly difficult." Clara, though pale and shaken, obliged with steady hands, creating a neat, symmetrical bow with the natural right-handed loops that spoke of lifelong habit. Miss Marple examined the result with apparent satisfaction before turning to Miss Hartnell with the same mild request. "And perhaps you would demonstrate the method you prefer for the church hampers. One learns so much from observing different approaches to familiar tasks." Miss Hartnell's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she took the ribbon, but her movements were swift and sure, creating the distinctive left-handed pattern with the unconscious expertise that comes only from years of repetition. The knot was identical in structure to those that had bound the stolen family papers, a detail that hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be voiced. "Thank you both," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though her keen eyes had noted every nuance of the demonstration. "It's remarkable how our habits betray us, even when we attempt to be clever. Left-handed knots are quite impossible to duplicate convincingly with the wrong hand, just as the precise dosage of chloral hydrate requires either extensive pharmaceutical knowledge or considerable experience with sedatives." Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed attention. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Simply that the evidence against Clara has been most carefully arranged by someone who understood that the obvious suspect would be either Timothy as the heir or his fiancée with her nursing background. The planted satchel, the bicycle tracks made after the murder was discovered, even the missing papers hidden in Timothy's room, all designed to create a convincing case while providing just enough inconsistencies to ensure reasonable doubt." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm as she continued, but the real killer made several crucial errors. The holly sprig in the study came from the church decorations, identifiable by its distinctive wire gauge, yet Clara had no involvement with those arrangements. The bicycle repair was requested at dawn by a veiled lady who knew exactly where to find Mr. Reed, suggesting intimate knowledge of village routines. Most tellingly, the investigator's report was stolen by someone who knew precisely where Mrs. Hartwell kept her private correspondence. Miss Hartnell's composure was beginning to fray visibly. Her hands, usually so busy and precise, lay clenched in her lap, and her breathing had become carefully controlled. "This is all fascinating speculation, Miss Marple, but hardly conclusive evidence of anything." "Oh, but there is evidence," Miss Marple replied with gentle certainty. "You see, when the investigator's report was burned behind the mantelpiece, a fragment survived, caught in the holly wire. That fragment revealed not only Mr. Ashford's criminal background, but also his pattern of working with female confederates who provided intelligence about potential victims. Women in positions of trust and authority who could gather sensitive information about their neighbors' vulnerabilities. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Hartwell gasped audibly, while Timothy stared at Miss Hartnell with dawning horror. The woman who had organized their charitable activities and managed their community standards had been systematically betraying their trust for personal gain. The partnership was profitable but dangerous, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying quiet authority. It required maintaining perfect respectability while secretly gathering information that made confidence schemes possible. When Mrs. Hartwell engaged investigators to verify Mr. Ashford's claims, the threat of exposure became too great to ignore. Miss Hartnell rose abruptly from her chair, her face flushed and her eyes holding a wild, cornered look. "Even if your theories were correct, you have no proof of any connection between myself and this man." Miss Marple smiled with gentle triumph. "Actually, I believe we do." She turned toward the mantelpiece, where the Christmas garland hung in festive splendor. "When you adjusted those decorations last evening, claiming they were inadequately arranged, you were actually retrieving something you had hidden there earlier, something that would have proven your connection to Mr. Ashford beyond any doubt." With careful deliberation, Miss Marple rose and approached the mantelpiece. Her fingers traced the holly swag until they found the precise spot where the gilt molding bore a small nick, barely visible unless one knew where to look. A ring was caught here and pulled free in haste, leaving this telltale mark. A signet ring, perhaps, bearing a distinctive design that Mr. Ashford used to seal his correspondence. Miss Hartnell's mask of respectability finally cracked completely. "You cannot prove any of this. There is no ring, no evidence of any partnership." "Oh, but there is," Miss Marple said softly. She reached behind the holly swag, her fingers probing the narrow ledge where shadows concealed small objects from casual observation. When her hand emerged, it held a small golden signet ring bearing the carved image of a rampant lion, the same design that young Daphne had observed Mr. Ashford using to seal his letters. The ring fell from Miss Hartnell's nerveless fingers when Miss Marple held it up to the light, its golden surface catching the firelight like a small, damning star. The woman who had terrorized committee meetings with her organizational efficiency stood revealed as something far more sinister, a predator who had used her position of trust to systematically exploit her neighbors for financial gain. The Christmas angel paperweight was particularly appropriate, Miss Marple observed with gentle irony. A symbol of peace and goodwill transformed into an instrument of violence, rather like your own. Transformation from pillar of the community to accomplice in fraud and murder. Miss Hartnell's composure shattered entirely, years of carefully maintained respectability crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. The partnership with Ashford had required her to balance her public persona with secret betrayal, gathering intelligence that made their schemes possible while maintaining the trust of those she was systematically deceiving. When the investigator's report threatened to expose everything, murder had seemed the only solution to preserve both her freedom and her reputation. Inspector Slack moved toward her with professional determination, his earlier embarrassment transformed into grim satisfaction at finally apprehending the real killer. The Christmas gathering that had begun with such festive promise was ending with the exposure of a betrayal that struck at the very heart of village life, revealing that their most trusted member had been their most dangerous enemy all along. The twilight shadows deepened across Meadowbank House as Miss Marple quietly suggested that perhaps they might examine one final piece of evidence together. Inspector Slack arranged his notes with diminished confidence, Miss Marple's gentle observations having introduced uncomfortable doubts into what had seemed a straightforward case against Clara Beaumont. The company gathered with the subdued compliance of people who sensed the evening's revelations were far from complete. Miss Marple settled herself near the fireplace, reaching into her knitting bag to produce 2 lengths of blue ribbon identical to those that had bound the stolen family papers. "Clara, my dear, would you be so kind as to tie one of these for me? My poor fingers find such tasks increasingly difficult." Clara, though pale and shaken, obliged with steady hands, creating a neat, symmetrical bow with the natural right-handed loops that spoke of lifelong habit. Miss Marple examined the result with apparent satisfaction before turning to Miss Hartnell with the same mild request. "And perhaps you would demonstrate the method you prefer for the church hampers? One learns so much from observing different approaches to familiar tasks." Miss Hartnell's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she took the ribbon, but her movements were swift and sure, creating the distinctive left-handed pattern with unconscious expertise. The knot was identical in structure to those that had bound the stolen papers, a detail that hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be voiced. "Thank you both," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though her keen eyes had noted every nuance. "It's remarkable how our habits betray us, even when we attempt to be clever. Left-handed knots are quite impossible to duplicate convincingly with the wrong hand, just as the precise dosage of chloral hydrate requires either extensive pharmaceutical knowledge or considerable experience with sedatives." She paused, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Your late father was the village pharmacist, wasn't he, Miss Hartnell? Such knowledge would naturally be passed down through family tradition." Miss Hartnell's composure flickered, but she rallied with characteristic authority. "I fail to see how childhood memories of a pharmacy could be considered evidence of anything criminal, Miss Marple." "Oh, but there's so much more," Miss Marple continued gently. "You see, when I discovered that fragment of the investigator's report behind the mantelpiece, it revealed not only Mr. Ashford's criminal background, but also his pattern of working with female confederates, women in positions of trust who could gather sensitive information about potential victims." She reached behind the holly swag where her fingers had earlier probed, retrieving the small golden signet ring. This was caught in the wire when you hastily adjusted the decorations, claiming they were inadequately arranged even after such a shocking discovery. The ring fell from Miss Hartnell's nerveless fingers as Miss Marple held it to the light, its carved lion catching the firelight like a small, damning star. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. The chloral hydrate dosage was remarkably precise. Too much would have rendered him immediately unconscious. Too little would have been ineffective. 8 drops, I'd estimate, to avoid the bitter taste. Miss Hartnell's mouth opened before caution could close it. 8 drops would be far too much for a man of his size, she corrected automatically. 6 drops in brandy, no more, to ensure— She caught herself, pressing her lips together until the color drained from them, but the damage was done. Her pharmaceutical expertise had betrayed her as surely as her left-handed knots. "There was never any intruder," Miss Marple observed quietly. "You opened the French doors twice, once after striking Mr. Ashford, again later to stage the disorder. The overlapping watermarks on the carpet tell that story quite clearly. You crushed a sprig of holly from the church decorations beneath the windowsill and left the angel paperweight as a weapon no burglar would reasonably choose to carry." Miss Hartnell's mask of respectability finally cracked completely. "He was going to destroy everything," she said, her voice carrying brittle desperation. "Years of partnership, of gathering information that made our schemes profitable, and he threatened to expose it all when Mrs. Hartwell's investigators grew too close. He laughed when I asked for the report back, struck my wrist when I tried to take it, said he would call me what he liked in front of you all. So you sedated him first during the early evening when he took brandy in the study, Miss Marple continued. When he became sluggish and manageable, you struck him with the paperweight. Then you rifled the desk for show, burned the report behind the mantelpiece, carelessly, leaving that fragment caught in the wire, and planted evidence to implicate Clara. The bicycle tracks made after midnight, the satchel dropped at dawn near the mill stream, even the family papers hidden in Timothy's room. All very thorough, except for the timing inconsistencies that revealed the deception. Inspector Slack stepped forward with professional determination, his earlier embarrassment transformed into grim satisfaction. Miss Hartnell, I'm arresting you for the murder of Barnaby Ashford and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the constable led her away, her head held high in final defiant pride, the drawing room exhaled softly, like a creature that had been holding its breath. Mrs. Hartwell sank into her chair, relief and sorrow warring in her expression. Timothy moved to support his aunt, while Clara's hands finally stopped their trembling. The Christmas decorations maintained their cheerful vigil, though their festive spirit seemed forever changed by the revelations beneath their boughs. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, reflecting that villages were much like their decorations, never as innocent as those who didn't know them imagined, rarely as wicked as disappointment suggested. The Christmas guest who had arrived so mysteriously had brought his own destruction, but it was the trusted pillar of their community who had delivered the fatal blow. The season of peace and goodwill had revealed instead the dangerous currents that could flow beneath the most respectable facades, reminding them all that human nature remained endlessly complex and occasionally terrifying. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in pristine white that would, in time, help heal the wounds of betrayal and restore the fragile trust that bound their small community together. The silence that followed Miss Hartnell's departure seemed to settle over Meadowbank House like snow, muffling the very air with the weight of revelation. Inspector Slack's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he supervised the removal of evidence, his earlier confidence replaced by the chastened efficiency of a man who had nearly made a terrible mistake. The drawing room, which had witnessed such festive cheer only 2 nights earlier, now bore the peculiar stillness that follows the exposure of long-hidden truths. Mrs. Hartwell remained seated in her chair, her hands folded with the careful composure of someone whose world had shifted fundamentally beneath her feet. The woman who had organized their charitable committees and maintained their social standards had been systematically betraying their trust for years, gathering intelligence that made confident schemes possible while presenting herself as the very embodiment of village virtue. I keep thinking about all the times she visited, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor of violated trust. The afternoon teas, the committee meetings, the casual conversations about family matters. She knew about my financial arrangements, my concerns about Timothy's future, even my doubts about distant relatives. All of it was being reported to that dreadful man. Dr. Haydock moved toward the decanters with practical purpose. I think we could all use something rather stronger than tea, he observed, his medical training recognizing the signs of delayed shock settling over the company. Timothy knelt beside his aunt's chair, offering what comfort he could, while Clara's own ordeal finally began to show in the trembling of her hands. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away with characteristic tidiness, her keen eyes observing how each person processed the evening's revelations. She had seen such betrayals before, in the seemingly peaceful confines of villages that prided themselves on knowing everyone's business. The most dangerous criminals were often those who understood that the best hiding place was in plain sight, cloaked in respectability and indispensable service. Inspector Slack returned from the hallway, his notebook in hand and his manner considerably humbled. The confession she provided during the journey was quite comprehensive, he announced to the assembled company. The partnership with Ashford began nearly 5 years ago when he approached her about her late father's pharmaceutical records, claiming to be researching historical medical practices. She recognized his true intentions, but saw an opportunity for financial gain that her modest pension could never provide. The inspector consulted his notes with professional precision. Their method was diabolically clever. Miss Hartnell would identify potential victims through her position in village society, gathering intimate details about financial difficulties, family tensions, and inheritance concerns. That information allowed Ashford to approach his targets with convincing documentation and compelling personal knowledge that made his claims nearly irresistible. Mr. Petherick nodded grimly. The Pemberton family in Little Wickham was their first collaboration. Miss Hartnell's knowledge of the widow's financial anxieties allowed Ashford to present himself as a solution to her problems. They extracted nearly £2,000 before disappearing, leaving Mrs. Pemberton convinced she had been legitimately cheated rather than deliberately swindled. The full scope of the betrayal settled over them gradually, like the understanding that follows initial shock. Clara, who had come so close to bearing the blame for murder, finally found her voice. The bicycle tracks, the planted evidence, even the satchel by the mill stream, she orchestrated everything to ensure I would face the gallows for a crime I didn't commit. If Miss Marple hadn't noticed the inconsistencies. The most tragic aspect, Miss Marple observed gently, is how thoroughly she corrupted her position of trust. Miss Hartnell genuinely believed in maintaining community standards and preserving social order. Yet she was simultaneously using that very respectability to exploit the vulnerabilities of those who trusted her most completely. The remainder of Christmas Day passed in subdued conversation and gradual processing of the evening's revelations. News of Miss Hartnell's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed that only village communication could achieve, carried by telephone calls and brave souls who ventured through the snow to share the shocking intelligence. "Not Miss Hartnell," became the common refrain, followed by the uncomfortable realization that if their most trusted member could harbor such secrets, the foundations of village life were less secure than anyone had imagined. Boxing Day dawned clear and cold, with church bells calling the community together in the ancient ritual of shared worship and mutual comfort. Miss Marple attended the service with Mrs. Hartwell and Timothy, observing how the congregation looked at one another with subtle differences. A new wariness in familiar faces, a questioning of assumptions that had seemed unshakable only days before. Mrs. Clement sang with unusual softness, while Mr. Reed's carols carried more tenderness than precision, as though the music itself sought to heal what harsh revelation had wounded. In the days that followed, as the snow gradually melted and the village began its tentative return to normal routines, Miss Marple remained at Meadowbank House, her quiet presence serving as a steadying influence during the difficult process of rebuilding trust. She watched Mrs. Hartwell slowly regain her composure, though a new wariness had entered her eyes that would likely never entirely fade. Timothy and Clara, their love strengthened by the ordeal they had survived, began planning their future with the sobering knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything to a carefully orchestrated deception. The missing family papers were recovered and properly secured, while Mr. Petherick began the legal process of protecting Mrs. Hartwell's estate against future opportunists. The investigator's report, reconstructed from surviving fragments and official records, revealed the full extent of Miss Hartnell's collaboration in schemes that had victimized families across 3 counties, always leaving behind bewildered victims who believed themselves the unfortunate targets of legitimate but distant relatives. One afternoon, as early spring flowers began to push through the thawing earth, Mrs. Hartwell joined Miss Marple by the drawing-room window. "I still can't quite believe it," she confessed quietly. "All those years of friendship, all that trust, how could she live with such deception?" Miss Marple's needles worked with their familiar rhythm as she considered the question. Human nature is a fascinating and perplexing thing, my dear. We all wear masks to some degree, but Miss Hartnell's was particularly elaborate. She understood that the most effective way to hide is often to be the most visible, the most indispensable. Her mask of impeccable respectability and tireless service allowed her to move freely, to gather information, and to remain above suspicion even when her victims discovered they had been deceived. She gazed out at the garden, where crocuses dotted the lawn like scattered jewels. It's a sad thing to see a life so warped by ambition and fear. She must have felt trapped between Mr. Ashford's growing demands and the terror of exposure. For some people, the thought of losing their carefully constructed reputation is more frightening than any crime they might commit to preserve it. As Miss Marple prepared to return to her own cottage in St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the complex patterns of human behavior that the Christmas mystery had revealed. The village would heal, as villages always did, though the comfortable predictability of their small community had been irrevocably altered. The memory of the Christmas guest who wasn't invited would fade into local legend, retold with shivers and whispered warnings about the deceptiveness of appearances. Yet something valuable had been gained as well as lost. The villagers had learned to look more carefully beneath the surface of respectability, to question assumptions about virtue and vice that had seemed unshakable. Miss Marple tucked her knitting more securely in her bag, knowing that while innocence once lost could never be fully recovered, wisdom earned through painful experience had its own considerable value. The season of peace and goodwill had delivered harsh lessons about human nature, but it had also demonstrated the resilience of communities that chose to rebuild trust rather than surrender to suspicion. The Christmas decorations at Meadowbank House were finally taken down, their festive cheer no longer seeming incongruous, but rather a reminder that joy and sorrow, trust and betrayal, innocence and wisdom all formed part of the complex tapestry of human experience. Miss Marple walked home through the village lanes, her sharp mind already turning over the eternal patterns of behavior that made each mystery both unique and familiar, each solution both surprising and inevitable in its revelation of the enduring complexities of the human heart. The morning light filtered through the frost-etched windows of St. Mary Mead as Inspector Slack made his final visit to Miss Marple's cottage, carrying with him the completed threads of their Christmas mystery. He sat in her comfortable parlor, accepting tea with the humble demeanor of a man who had learned valuable lessons about the complexity of human nature and the danger of obvious assumptions. The final confirmations came through from Scotland Yard, he announced, consulting his notebook with renewed respect for thoroughness. Our Mr. Ashford was actually Frederick Barnaby Nash, a professional confidence man with operations across 3 counties. The signet ring you discovered matched impressions found on forged documents in Hampshire and Berkshire. Miss Hartnell's confession has been remarkably comprehensive. She's provided details of at least 7 separate schemes they conducted together over the past 5 years. Miss Marple's needles worked steadily as she absorbed this information. And the initials from the investigator's report. Ah, yes, that was particularly clever of you to question. The baptismal records confirm that Clara Ann Beaumont's middle name is indeed Anne, making her initials CAB. However, Miss Hartnell's full Christian names, as recorded in the parish register, are Constance Beatrice Hartnell. The CB in the report referred to her all along. Inspector Slack's admiration was evident as he continued. She used her pharmaceutical knowledge, inherited from her father's practice, to administer precisely 6 drops of chloral hydrate in Mr. Nash's brandy. Any more would have rendered him unconscious immediately, any less would have been ineffective for her purposes. In the days that followed, Meadowbank House gradually shed its atmosphere of shock and suspicion. Mrs. Hartwell, though bearing the invisible scars of profound betrayal, began to reclaim her natural strength and dignity. The woman who had trusted so completely in Miss Hartnell's guidance now approached her affairs with a more cautious wisdom, consulting Mr. Petherick about establishing a fund to assist other victims of the Nash-Hartnell partnership. Timothy and Clara's relationship had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the ordeal. Their wedding plans, once elaborate social affairs, were now simplified to focus on what truly mattered: their genuine affection and shared commitment to honesty. Clara, who had come so close to bearing the blame for murder, carried herself with a new quiet strength, while Timothy's protective instincts had matured into a deeper understanding of life's genuine priorities. "I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about people," Mrs. Hartwell confided to Miss Marple during one of their afternoon conversations. "How could someone who seemed so devoted to community service harbor such calculating malice?" Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "My dear, Miss Hartnell genuinely believed in maintaining standards and preserving order, but she corrupted these virtues by placing her own security above the welfare of others. The most dangerous criminals are often those who convince themselves that their actions serve a higher purpose, even when that purpose is merely their own comfort and reputation." The news of Miss Hartnell's arrest had rippled through St. Mary Mead like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of disbelief, speculation, and, ultimately, a sobering reassessment of assumptions. The woman who had organized their charitable committees and maintained their social standards had been systematically betraying their trust, gathering intimate details about their vulnerabilities to facilitate elaborate confidence schemes. Yet the village demonstrated the remarkable resilience that Miss Marple had observed in countless communities faced with the exposure of hidden corruption. Mrs. Price Ridley, usually quick with cutting remarks, spoke with uncharacteristic gentleness about the need for compassion even in the face of betrayal. Colonel Melchett, his military bearing intact, admitted privately that the affair had taught him to look more carefully beneath the surface of apparent respectability. Dr. Haydock, whose medical expertise had helped expose the precise nature of the crime, reflected on how Miss Hartnell's pharmaceutical knowledge had been turned to such sinister purposes. She understood exactly how to render someone manageable without causing immediate unconsciousness. It speaks to years of careful study and planning. As winter gradually gave way to the first hints of spring, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village lanes, observing how the community had processed its shock and begun the delicate work of rebuilding trust. The Christmas decorations had long since been packed away, but their memory lingered, a reminder of how festive cheer could mask the darkest human intention. She paused by the church where Mr. Reed was practicing his Easter preparations, the bells carrying a gentler tone than their Christmas predecessors. The seasonal cycle continued, indifferent to human drama, yet somehow healing in its predictable progression from darkness toward light. "People are much like these decorations," she mused to herself, watching early crocuses push through the thawing earth. "We see the surface presentation, the holly and ribbons of respectability, but the true nature lies deeper, in the habits and choices that reveal themselves only under pressure." The mystery of the Christmas guest who wasn't invited had taught St. Mary Mead valuable lessons about the deceptiveness of appearances and the importance of looking beyond surface virtues to understand genuine character. Miss Hartnell's betrayal had shaken their comfortable assumptions, but it had also demonstrated that communities could survive even the most profound violations of trust when they chose wisdom over cynicism. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her knitting and a cup of properly brewed tea, she reflected on the curious patterns of human behavior that made each mystery both unique and familiar. The Christmas season, meant to celebrate peace and goodwill, had instead revealed the dangerous currents that could flow beneath even the most respectable facades. Yet there was hope in the village's response, in Mrs. Hartwell's determination to help other victims, in Timothy and Clara's deepened commitment to honesty, in the community's gradual return to trust, tempered with appropriate caution. The snow had melted, The decorations were stored away, and life continued its eternal rhythm of challenge and recovery, loss and renewal. Outside her window, the village lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each representing lives that had absorbed shocking revelations and chosen to continue building rather than surrender to permanent suspicion. Miss Marple smiled into the gathering darkness, knowing that while human nature remained endlessly complex and occasionally dangerous, it also possessed the remarkable capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and growth. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had brought secrets and violence to their peaceful community, but his death had also revealed truths about trust, betrayal, and the importance of looking carefully beneath the surface of apparent virtue. The season of peace and goodwill had delivered harsh lessons, but St. Mary Mead would endure, perhaps a little wiser and certainly more cautious, yet still fundamentally committed to the belief that people could live together in harmony when they remained vigilant about the complexities that lurked beneath even the most respectable appearances. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away with quiet satisfaction, knowing that her village would face whatever challenges the future might bring with the accumulated wisdom that came from understanding both the best and worst possibilities of the human heart.